Pride. That was what shone in the boy's eyes when it was his turn. He held the paper with his small but steady hands. It was presentation day at school. Each child would tell what their father's job was. A simple moment, but one that meant a lot to him. His heart pounded. It wasn't nerves. It was the desire to be heard. He stood, straightened the collar of his well-worn uniform, which still smelled of a clean house. Then he said, "My father works at the Pentagon." The words came out in the firm voice of someone who knew exactly what he was saying. But that was all it took, just that, for the world to collapse into dry laughter. The teacher was the first to laugh. It wasn't a full-blown laugh. It was worse. That smirk of someone who finds other people's naivete amusing. "You should make up a more acceptable lie," she said. Then she turned to the class and added, "Let's keep our feet on the ground, everyone. No tall tales." The class burst into laughter. But it wasn't the phrase itself that hurt the most. It was the echo. The collective laughter that arose wasn't just about the surprise of the profession mentioned. It was about the person who said it. A black boy, with curly hair, dark skin, sitting in the last row. He wasn't wearing expensive sneakers or a designer backpack. It was him. And because it was him, that phrase became a joke. No white child who talked about fathers being doctors, engineers, or heads of something was interrupted. But when he, just as naturally, said Pentagon, the room became a circus. No one there realized, or wanted to realize, that the cruelty was hidden beneath the surface. In the silence that screamed, "Black people don't have that kind of father." The teacher didn't need to say it out loud. Her look said it all. The contempt was in her tone, in her mockery, in the fact that she hadn't even considered the possibility that she was hearing the truth. The boy, who had remained standing until then, began to wilt. First his shoulders dropped, then his eyes. But he said nothing. He simply sat down, without arguing. The embarrassment was visible on some faces, but no one did anything. One or two students stopped laughing after noticing he didn't smile back, but it was too late. The damage was already done. His image was etched there, not as the son of someone important, but as the boy with the funny lie. And as the class continued, feigning normality, he remained quiet. Quiet as only someone who has learned to swallow the world can be. But inside him, something was beginning to shift. It wasn't anger. It was a question that echoed, as if his childhood were shattering. Why didn't they believe me? But truth doesn't depend on who believes it. And that room would still have to face the weight of a reality it never imagined possible. The classroom smelled of old paint and wet chalk. The walls, with their colorful posters trying to appear cheerful, seemed grayer that morning. There was something in the air, and it wasn't just dust. It was a kind of silence that spoke loudly to those who knew how to listen. The kind of silence that grows where prejudice hides behind routine. The boy sat in the corner, as usual. This wasn't the first time he'd felt the ground disappear beneath his feet without anyone around him noticing. But something about that collective laughter had been different. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was an uncomfortable certainty. There, he would never be taken seriously. Not for lack of words, but because he was black. The school claimed to teach equality, but the invisible rules told a different story. When a white student said his father was a businessman, no one laughed or asked for proof. When a white girl said her father was a farm owner, everyone believed him. But when he mentioned the Pentagon, everyone laughed. It wasn't the position that caused shock. It was the body that said it. That's what he began to understand, even without yet having a name for what he felt. The disbelief wasn't against history. It was against the possibility that he, a black boy, was part of it. His hair, his skin, his quiet demeanor didn't fit the imagery of that classroom, because in that school, as in so many others, black people always needed to justify themselves to perhaps be taken seriously. And the teacher, with laughter in her voice and the ruler of authority in her hand, reinforced this without realizing it, or perhaps realizing it too much. She didn't expel him with direct words, but with the symbolic force of a public denial. She said, without saying it, "You don't belong in this narrative." And this echoed in the eyes of every student who looked at him with pity, doubt, or mockery. The boy didn't answer, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he'd learned early on that, for some bodies, silence was safer than reason. What would he say? That his father was a systems engineer with top-secret clearance, that they'd moved to that neighborhood for a transfer. Who would believe it? Who would listen without laughing again? At recess, He sat alone. The voices around him seemed louder than ever, as if the world wanted to drown out what he couldn't yet name, the weight of carrying a discredited body, a body that always needed to prove itself before being allowed to exist with dignity. He sat there, his eyes fixed on some random spot, trying to understand why it still hurt so much. The pain wasn't just from what was said, it was from what was understood by everyone, even without it being spoken. It was the unspoken but blatant question, do you think black people have that kind of father? Not spoken aloud, but in every gesture, in every laugh, in every look that measured him before listening. And as the afternoon drew to a close, he returned to the living room with his shoulders even more hunched, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion, an old exhaustion that had once lodged itself in his grandmother's bones, in his grandfather's silences, and now found shelter in his young skin. But there was something there, hidden behind those tired eyes, something that had not yet completely quieted. And in the midst of that painful silence, a small flame was born, ready to become memory or revolution. The next morning, he could still taste the laughter stuck in his throat. He woke earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but out of the kind of vigilance only those who have been exposed in public know. She sat on the edge of the bed, her feet still hesitantly touching the carpet, her backpack packed beside her, her notebooks triple-checked. She didn't want to make any more mistakes. She couldn't give any more reasons. On the way to school, the noise of the world seemed muffled. The sound of tires on cobblestones, the bird song, even the sound of footsteps, everything seemed smaller, as if the universe had gone into standby mode, waiting for the next wound, the next silence, the next failed attempt at resistance. He entered the room cautiously. He avoided eyes. He chose a seat at the back, where he could see without being seen. He sat down slowly, as if afraid that even the creaking of the chair would give him away. When the teacher entered, he held his breath for a second, not for fear of punishment, but of repetition, of the cycle, of the never-ending joke. She walked past him without looking. She continued her lesson as if nothing had happened, and perhaps, for her, nothing had. But he still carried the sound of that sentence like a constant buzz. You should make up a more acceptable lie. So short, so sharp, so permanent. At the first opportunity, he tried to raise his hand to answer. He wanted to show he was present, that he knew the material, that he was capable, but his hand remained there, half raised, until she chose another student. He smiled on the outside, as if he understood, but inside, the gesture sank, like a stone thrown into a deep well, no return. During recess, an attempt at conversation, a classmate approached, laughed, and said, "Hey, secret agent." The tone was joking, but it wasn't a joke. It was reinforcement. It was a reminder. He tried to laugh back, to protect himself, but the sound that came out was more of a sigh than anything else, because their laughter was a way to keep quiet, and keeping quiet, a way to survive. In the third period, the teacher asked everyone to write an essay about my greatest pride. He froze. He thought about his father. He thought about the uniform, the badge, the irregular schedules. He thought about the night he arrived with the uniform and the smell of metal and longing. But he didn't write about that. He wrote about the dog, because no one would doubt the dog. The dog was neutral. The dog didn't make anyone laugh. When he handed over the sheet of paper, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a mixture difficult to explain, a kind of exhaustion mixed with shame. Shame for having remained silent, shame for having omitted, shame for knowing he was learning to hide his own brilliance so as not to be burned by it. On his way out, he passed the wall where the best works were displayed. He saw a colleague's text about his architect father, another about his judge mother. The texts were decorated, pasted with colorful tape. His wasn't there, and he wasn't even sure he wanted it to be. That day, he understood something that hurt more than the teacher's laughter. Sometimes, the greatest trauma doesn't come from a scream. It comes from what one learns to swallow in order to carry on. It comes from the painful realization that, for many, existing truthfully is a form of provocation. But truth has roots, and even buried, it continues to grow, until the moment when no one can pretend not to see it. On the third day after the incident, his routine continued as if nothing had happened. The desks were in the same place. The teacher wore the same neutral clothes. The students laughed at the same things. But for him, time no longer passed the same way. Everything seemed to be in slow motion, as if each second made more noise than the last. In history class, the teacher was talking about civil rights. She showed black and white images of protests. The boy looked at the screen and then back at the teacher. It was like hearing an echo from a world she herself had never visited. He thought about standing up, about saying something, anything, but he remained silent, because even in that justice class, he knew raising your hand was a risk, and risk, for people like him, is almost never accompanied by applause. As she spoke, he looked around, searching their faces for some sign, a memory, a spark of discomfort. Nothing. His classmates continued drawing in their notebooks, whispering, waiting for the bell to ring. No one seemed to bear the weight of what had happened, except him. But there was a boy, the one in the middle row. His eyes were restless and his lips moved discreetly, as if trying to formulate a sentence he couldn't quite get out. At one point, they looked at each other, quickly, briefly, but it was enough. A tiny gesture, a near nod, as if to say, "I saw," that was all. And even without further words, that near gesture had the weight of a shelter. It's strange how a look can give him breath, no matter how brief, no matter how silent. It was the first time since the humiliation that he didn't feel completely alone, but he soon fell back to the ground, because his colleague also fell silent. Because the fear of being next is greater than the impulse to defend the other. The bystander effect is cruel. The more people in the room, the less likely anyone is to act. But in this case, there was something more. It was the hierarchy of power, the fear of confronting not only the teacher, but the system she represents. The idea that if she said something, it's because she can, and if she can, contesting it is dangerous. When class ended, the boy stayed a little longer. He put his books away slowly, like someone waiting for the room to empty before taking a breath. But this time, he wasn't alone. The boy in the middle row waited too. He came closer. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "It was wrong." He just said, "My uncle works at a NASA lab. No one believes me either." It was a connecting thread, a meeting between two solitudes, and, for a moment, the pain lessened. Because now she had a witness, someone who understood. But what none of them knew was that the next day, the truth would walk through the front door and silence all the smiles. Friday arrived with the same cloudy sky as Monday. But something, that day, moved differently. The boy woke to the same silence as every morning. But this time, the silence had a different texture. It wasn't the usual fear. It was as if there was a secret in the air, as if time were holding its breath. The backpack was packed more slowly, the uniform, more carefully, his hair, more carefully. He didn't know why. He couldn't name the feeling. He just felt it. When he arrived at school, everything seemed the same. The noisy courtyard, the bustling hallways, the teacher's footsteps echoing on the polished floor. But as he entered the classroom, time slowed down. The clock on the wall struck 8:15 as he sat down. A minute later, the door opened again, and the world stood still. A tall, elegant black man, wearing a well-cut dark blue suit, walked through the door with calm steps. On his chest hung an official badge, but it wasn't the badge that spoke first. It was the look in his eyes, a look that didn't ask permission, but didn't shout either. It was the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself. It imposes itself through silence. The room froze. The smiles faded. The teacher turned, still smiling, perhaps expecting a random visitor, an ordinary father. But when her eyes met his, she hesitated, an imperceptible hitch in her breath, as if reality had suddenly stopped obeying the logic she knew. He didn't say good morning. He walked over to his son's desk. He touched his shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that meant so much. The boy looked up, and what he saw in that moment wasn't relief. It was recognition, as if they both knew this wasn't just about them. It was about everyone. The man then turned to the room, to the teacher, to the time. He spoke softly, in a firm voice. "My name is Major Antonio Luis, Senior National Security Analyst, currently on a cooperative mission between the Department of Defense and NATO." There was no need to say more, but he did. "I'm the father of the student who was discredited and ridiculed in this room this week." He looked directly at the teacher. "I didn't come here to demand anything. I just came to show that he didn't lie." Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of embarrassment, but the thick silence of impact. The teacher tried to stammer something. No, it was just..." But the sentence died before it could be uttered, because there was no more room for justification. That man's presence, without raising his voice, had turned the structure of the room upside down. He handed the teacher an envelope with a formal letter. Then he looked at the class, not with anger, but with something harder to maintain: dignity. And dignity, when firm, is disarming. No child dared to joke. No classmate smiled. He then turned to his son and said, "You don't have to be silent to fit in. Not ever again." The boy nodded. His hands on his desk trembled slightly. But it wasn't fear. It was something new, something called legitimacy. And when he left the room, the air remained thick, as if the truth, finally revealed, was still choosing what to do with the silence that remained. The clock in the room read 8:37 when the door closed behind the man. But no one looked at the hand. Everyone was focused on the space that remained. Not empty, but filled with a kind of silence that was no longer discomfort. It was something else. It was the silent acknowledgement that something had been exposed and could no longer be undone. The teacher stood still for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on the sheet of paper he'd left on her desk. It wasn't just a formal letter. It was a mirror. The facts were accurately and respectfully reported there. But more than that, there was the weight of a presence that disproved all the assumptions made days before. She tried to resume class. She called the name of the first student on the list, her voice a little softer than usual, but no one answered. The air was still charged. The boy, the unwanted center of that storm, remained silent. But now the silence wasn't defense. It was fertile ground. It was the interval between pain and the realization that it wasn't her fault. Then something strange happened. The principal entered the classroom. He greeted the students kindly and asked if he could speak to the teacher in the hallway. They left, and the walls heard what no one said. Meanwhile, in the classroom, eyes turned, one by one, to the boy. But they weren't mocking looks. They were new looks. Looks of someone who, for the first time, saw a classmate not just as the different one in the class, but as someone who had endured something few could have endured. The boy in the middle row, the one who almost waved, slowly raised his hand. He said, "I think we should apologize." No one laughed. Some lowered their eyes. Others nodded silently. There was no speech. There was no formal apology. But there was a collective movement, a gesture, a departure from indifference. When the teacher returned, the paper gone, her eyes were red. There were no tears, but something was broken. She tried to resume the lesson, but the words didn't come out firmly. For the first time, the authority of her position wasn't enough. She looked at the boy, hesitated, and then simply said, "Let's move on." But her tone was different. It was quieter, less full. That was the first time he didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to defend himself. He didn't need to prove anything. The truth came to him on its own, not in shouts, but in presence, not in confrontation, but in legitimacy. And for the first time, he felt perhaps he could exist as a whole, without erasing parts of himself to fit into the world of others. At break time, he sat in the same spot as always, but he wasn't alone. 1, 2, 3 classmates approached. They didn't know what to say, so they just stood there, in silence, but a different silence, of companionship, of shy observation, of recognition. But outside, in the school hallways, something was still being rewritten, and that morning would not end without another change. In the main hallway, where once the echo of confident footsteps and unmistakable commands echoed, there was now an undisguised unease. The teacher walked with stiff, almost mechanical steps. The principal had requested her presence. It wasn't a harsh summons, but the neutral tone of the summons was enough for the floor to begin to crumble beneath the firmness she had always carried in her heels. Upon arriving at the principal's office, he found 3 chairs. In one of them sat the principal himself, looking more tired than irritated. Beside him sat the coordinator, and in the third, empty, sat a folder bearing the U.S. government logo. It was there that legitimacy waited to manifest itself, not as a threat, but as a mirror. The teacher tried to intervene. She said there had been a misunderstanding, that what she said had been taken out of context, and that she never meant to offend. The coordinator gently interrupted her. "It's not just about what was said, it's about what was left unheard." There was silence. The principal then opened the folder, took out a sheet of paper, and read quietly. It was the father's formal report, but more than a description of the facts, there was unease, a denunciation of a system that still today associates excellence with whiteness and distrust with dark skin, a sober text, without direct accusations, but with the strength of someone who no longer accepts being discredited for being outside the norm. The teacher, for the first time, didn't know how to respond. She, who always had sharp words and ready arguments, remained silent. And in that silence, something fell. Not her career, not her authority, but her certainty. That comfortable certainty that what she was doing was just a joke, just a comment, just an insight. She returned to the classroom, her body slightly more hunched. You didn't apologize. You didn't explain anything. He simply gathered his things and said he'd be leaving early. The warning was curt, but the mood was one of transition. The class, which had previously seen her as an unquestionable figure, now looked at her with different eyes, not with hatred, but with questioning. The boy didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just watched her leave with calm eyes. There was no revenge in that look. There was understanding that sometimes the greatest justice lies not in retaliation, but in allowing the other person to see, for themselves, the reflection of their own mistake. And when the door closed behind her, there was no celebration. There was silence. But this time, it was a clean silence, of a new beginning, of a changed world, of structures that, no matter how hard they try, can't resist being exposed to light. But in that boy's heart, something still needed to be resolved, and the next meeting would bring answers that no classroom could teach. The following week, the classroom was no longer the same. The sound of laughter seemed more subdued. The footsteps in the hallways were more cautious. The teacher didn't return. Officially, she was on medical leave, but everyone knew, even if they didn't know for sure, that something had broken, and it wasn't just the routine. The boy now stood a little taller, not out of arrogance, but out of merit. For the first time, he occupied his space without fear of shrinking. It wasn't a new space. It was the same as before. But now, no one borrowed him. No one doubted he fit there. In the classroom, his classmates still regarded him with a certain restrained reverence. It wasn't idolatry. It was respect. And respect, when born from the recognition of injustice, carries a different weight. It's not formal. It's genuine. The boy in the middle row now sat next to him. They shared the book, the pencil case, the silence. But there was an absence, a gap that time could not fill. The teacher did not return, and with her came no apology, no direct words, no letter, no formal acknowledgement, just disappearance. And that, to the boy, said a lot, because it wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about making someone pay. It was about being seen, heard, validated. And even after all that, there was something that remained, the silence of regret that never came, the refusal to admit the mistake, the attempt to maintain an image that no longer held up. His father talked to him about it. They sat at the kitchen table, as they did on Fridays. The boy asked, "Isn't she going to apologize?" His father took a deep breath and replied with something that stuck in his chest. Some people would rather break their conscience than admit they were wrong in front of a black person. It wasn't said in anger. It was said in pain, with the kind of pain that doesn't burn, but weighs heavily. The boy simply nodded. He understood that sometimes what we expect from others isn't what they have to give, and that justice, sometimes, doesn't come with the signature of the one who hurt us, but with the gaze of someone who finally recognizes us. On Saturday, they went to a bookstore together. The boy chose a book on black leadership. He said he wanted to learn more. He wanted to know where those who won without shouting came from. The father smiled with silent pride, because he knew that, in that son, something had awakened, and would not go back to sleep. And as they were driving home, the boy opened the book in the back seat, and found there, between the pages, a sentence that would seal everything he had experienced. That night, the boy read until late. Sitting on the bedroom floor, his back to the bed, he devoured the pages like someone discovering their own name written in an ancient book. There he found stories of leaders who faced the impossible with serenity, men and women who carried on their shoulders the same burden he was beginning to recognize, the burden of having to prove, every day, that they were worthy of being where they were. On one of the pages, an underlined sentence caught his attention. "You don't have to be extraordinary to deserve respect. You just have to exist." He read it quietly, and he stood there for long minutes, holding that sentence like someone holding an old key that suddenly makes sense. On Sunday, he calmly organized his school supplies. He set aside a blank sheet of paper, and, in the neat handwriting he inherited from his mother, he wrote a single sentence: "My father works at the Pentagon, and I am his son." He carefully folded the paper and placed it inside his pencil case. It wasn't for display, it was for memory. On Monday, when he entered the room, he felt the weight of their eyes on him. But now, he didn't shy away from them. He met their gazes as if walking on solid ground, not because everyone accepted him, but because, finally, he accepted himself completely, and that changes everything. During class, a new teacher introduced herself, young, soft-spoken, with attentive eyes. When she asked the students to describe themselves in one sentence, he was the last. He considered repeating what he had said before, but he preferred silence. He simply opened the pencil case, took out the folded sheet of paper, and placed it on the table. She read it. She smiled slightly and said, "Thank you for sharing this with me." It wasn't admiration, it was recognition. And recognition, when sincere, doesn't require applause, just presence. At the end of the day, as he left school, the boy didn't look back, but he left the handwritten note on top of his desk, not as a provocation, but as a seed. Perhaps, one day, someone will read it and understand that there was no boasting there. There was history, there was truth, and when he approached his father, who was waiting for him at the gate, he handed him the note with the same firmness as the first day. The man read it, put it in his inside jacket pocket, and simply said, "This is how you honor those who came before." The boy nodded, and as he walked beside his father, he knew, with the calm of someone who's seen too much to rush, that it was no longer about being believed. It was about no longer accepting being diminished. Dignity hadn't come with her father's badge, but with the choice not to allow her truth to be ridiculed. And that silent choice is the most powerful of all, because there are truths that don't ask for permission to exist. They only need courage to remain. If this story touched you in any way, if you saw yourself in it, or if you felt someone close to you being represented, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so that more Black voices can find space, dignity, and prominence. Leave your like so the algorithm understands what really matters. Share with anyone who needs a reminder that there is strength even in silence. And comment below, what was your favorite moment in this story? This channel is made by us, for us, because our stories deserve to be told with truth, respect, and soul.